What happens when silence becomes too heavy to bear? When the bloodline of a master flows through the veins of a slave? Can justice be born from fire? Who was Sarah of Virginia? And why did she burn the house down with everyone inside on Christmas Eve 1851? Some say it was vengeance. Others call it madness. But the truth may be far more disturbing than either. Are you ready to hear the story they tried to bury beneath the snow? If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. There is a silence that lingers in old houses, not the peaceful hush of rest, but the kind that presses against the ribs like a weight. The Bertram plantation, seated on the outskirts of Danville, Virginia, held such a silence. Built in 1792 by English hands and Southern gold, the house was a solemn witness to the decay of old wealth. Its white columns peeled under the sun, its windows, tall and narrow, stared outward with a hollow gaze. Yet inside the halls pulsed with power, cold, deliberate, and cruel. Sarah was brought there at the age of 9. She remembered the wagon, the iron collar too heavy for her thin neck, and the final glimpse of her mother being dragged away in the opposite direction. The house greeted her with indifference. No one welcomed her. No one asked her name. She was small, sharp-eyed, and quiet. That was enough for them to decide she would serve within the house. By 13, she had become the primary caretaker of the newborn twins, William and Jonathan Bertram. Their mother, Catherine, died days after their birth, consumed by fever and whispers of a family curse. Augustus Bertram, their father, did not mourn. He considered softness a threat. His gaze was iron, his discipline unquestionable. Sarah raised the boys as if they were her own. She fed them, rocked them, sang to them songs she barely remembered from her stolen childhood. They clung to her in the night when the storms came and laughed when she mimicked voices to make them eat. But they were not hers. Even at 5, they understood what she was less than them, and as they grew, that knowledge turned to cruelty. The Bertrams believed in order. Every room had its place, every object its function, and every soul its station. Augustus, tall and lean, with the stiffness of dried wood, upheld these divisions with a reverent brutality. He spoke rarely, but punished swiftly. The sound of his boots across the wooden floor signaled fear, not authority. At night, when the plantation fell still, Sarah often remained awake. The creak of a stair, the rattle of a door, these were sounds she learned to anticipate. Some nights they stopped at her room. Some nights they did not. Either way, she slept lightly, one hand always on the thin blanket that never kept out the cold. Old Mabel the cook warned her once, "Mind your soul, girl. Ain't no lock strong enough to keep a Bertram man from what he wants." Sarah didn't answer. She had no voice for it. Not yet. The fields outside bore cotton, and the barns bore screams. The slaves of the Bertram estate were not numbered by name, only by their yield. But Sarah, housebound and too close to the heart of the beast, saw more than most. She watched as her people withered under the sun. She listened to their whispers by the hearth. She memorized their silences. By her 22nd year, Sarah had become something strange, half servant, half shadow. She moved through the house like breath, through a cracked window, always present but never seen. Her eyes no longer wept. Her hands no longer trembled. She watched the twins become men with eyes too empty for their age, and she watched Augustus grow colder, slower, though never weaker. But the silence of the house was changing. It no longer pressed. It pulsed. Something old was stirring beneath the floorboards, behind the portraits, inside the bones of the place. And Sarah, ever quiet, ever watchful, felt it long before anyone else. The house of Bertram was not just a place. it was a wound, and wounds, if left to fester, do not simply bleed, they burn. By the winter of 1847, the Bertram twins had grown into young men with the posture of gentlemen and the tempers of jackals. William was the elder by minutes, and he wore the title like armor. Broad-shouldered and impatient, he had inherited his father's disdain for softness. Jonathan, quieter, favored stillness, and studied things with a chilling intensity. Together they were mirror and shadow, one impulsive, the other observant, but both hollow where empathy should reside. They no longer clung to Sarah. They summoned her, snapped fingers, barked commands. She ever still obeyed without pause. But behind her eyes, something had changed. There was a coldness now, tempered not by age, but by erosion. The boy she once fed from her breast now looked at her like a fixture of the house, useful, replaceable, invisible. And yet beneath their scorn, Sarah sensed something else, attention. A flicker of recognition neither of them dared to name. One evening, while tending to Jonathan's study, she overheard fragments of a conversation between the brothers. They spoke of a will, a trust fund, questions about Catherine's family and her quiet fortune. William laughed, short and bitter. Jonathan only said, "Father will not live forever." Sarah paused behind the door, unseen, her fingers tightening around a cloth soaked in oil and dust. In the servant quarters, old Mabel watched her. There was concern in her voice. "Now you're looking through people, girl, like you ain't standing on this ground no more." Sarah only said, "I see them clearer now." Mabel didn't press. Some truths are too heavy to carry unless you've worn their shape. Augustus Bertram had grown slower. His right hand, once steady with pen and pistol, trembled ever so slightly. But his tongue remained sharp. He no longer visited Sarah's room. He no longer needed to. Power once wielded through force had become a specter in his silence. The slaves feared him still, not for what he did, but for what he had taught his sons to enjoy. One morning a boy named Elias was caught stealing a spoonful of molasses, a minor sin, easily hidden. But William insisted on punishment. The lash fell 37 times. Sarah watched, her expression unreadable as the boy's back opened like parchment. Jonathan didn't watch. He recorded it in a small leather-bound book. In the weeks that followed, the plantation grew quieter. Even the birds seemed to avoid the house. Sarah, moving through the halls, sensed the air shifting. The portraits of dead Bertram seemed to lean forward. The floorboards creaked under truths too long buried. The mirrors began to feel like eyes. One night Mabel pulled her aside, and with a voice low and trembling said, "He's your father, Sarah. You knew it. You just didn't want the words." Sarah did not flinch. She nodded once. Augustus had never spoken it, never acknowledged it, but she had always known, in the way his gaze lingered too long, in the way her skin bore marks the others did not. The boys then were her brothers, by blood, by silence, by shame. The truth did not free her. It bound her tighter. A chain of blood is heavier than iron, and yet something loosened in her that night. Not hope. Hope was a language she had forgotten, but a seed of clarity, a realization that nothing in that house was born of love, only possession, only legacy. The next morning she awoke before the sun. The fields were still shadows. The house loomed behind her like a mausoleum, and in that cold silence, Sarah whispered to herself the name her mother once called her, the name no one in the house had ever known. It tasted like something long buried, like soil, like fire. December came with a hush that felt unnatural. The air over the Bertram estate hung heavy, not with snow, but with something weightless and suffocating, like dust disturbed in an old tomb. The fields had fallen still. The trees stood like mourners draped in frost. Even the wind seemed to hesitate at the edges of the house. Preparations for the annual Christmas gathering filled the halls with a manic energy. The house was scrubbed raw, silver polished, linens pressed. William paced like a man trying to outrun a thought. Jonathan wrote letters with unblinking concentration. Augustus remained locked in his study, emerging only to bark orders or remind Sarah of her place, with a look that said more than words. Sarah moved through the rituals in silence. Her hands peeled apples, rolled dough, lit candles, but her mind was elsewhere, watching from beneath every floorboard, every cracked window pane. She was not waiting. She was listening. One night, 2 days before the gathering, a girl named Emily was sent to clean the main hallway. Barely 16, with soft eyes and quick hands, she was new to the house. Sarah had warned her, never linger in the east wing after dark. But no one ever listened to warnings that came in whispers. Emily returned just before midnight, her apron torn, her voice gone. Sarah found her curled behind the stable, shivering with more than cold. Her eyes were wide, unseeing, her skin marked with bruises that would not show beneath a dress. Sarah did not speak. She wrapped the girl in a blanket, pressed a warm cloth to her neck, and waited until the shaking stopped. At dawn, Sarah went into the pantry and opened a cedar box tucked behind old jars of preserved peaches. Inside were 3 dolls, handmade and mended over the years. One had red thread for hair. One wore a blue ribbon around the neck. The third had no face. Sarah placed them gently on the table and began to wrap them in linen, stained with ash and old blood. Mabel entered the room, stood in silence, then whispered, "You still remember?" "I remember everything," Sarah replied. Later that evening, the first flakes of snow began to fall. The Bertram house glittered with candlelight, laughter, and the scent of roasted goose. Guests arrived in carriages, their boots shaking off frost as they crossed the threshold. Music played from a worn-out piano. The twins drank heavily, their voices rising and falling with cruel jokes and old stories. Augustus sat at the head of the long dining table, eyes half-lidded, content in his kingdom of rot. Sarah served each guest with steady hands. Her face was unreadable, her posture precise. She moved from room to room like a shadow with purpose. No one noticed when she disappeared into the cellar. No one saw the thin trail of oil that followed her back up the servant stairs. No one questioned the dampness in her hem. Just before midnight, Sarah climbed to the attic and opened the narrow window. Snow fell harder now, muffling sound, blanketing the world in white. She could see the fields stretching into darkness. The slave quarters were dark and still. The barn windows flickered with lamplight. She lit a single match and held it until the flame touched her skin. There was no prayer, no cry, only breath. And then the house began to speak, through smoke, through heat, through the roar of memory catching fire. But that moment had not yet come. Not quite, not fully, for now the dolls lay quiet on the table, the oil soaked into the wood, and Sarah waited, eyes closed, listening to the snow cover everything that still dared to live. Christmas Eve arrived beneath a sky the color of slate. The cold was sharper than knives, seeping into the stone and marrow of the Bertram house. By evening, guests had gathered again, fewer this year, as the roads were difficult, and the name Bertram no longer held the luster it once did. Still, the halls echoed with forced laughter, crystal clinking, and the heavy shuffle of boots over polished floors. Sarah wore her oldest dress, sleeves rolled to the elbow, apron spotless. She moved quietly, carrying trays, refilling glasses, offering slices of cured ham and gingerbread with a nod. Her face betrayed nothing, but her hands were steady in a way that suggested decision, not service. The fire in the main hearth crackled, casting long shadows that reached the ceiling. Jonathan and William argued over some triviality, their voices low but tense. Augustus sat alone, sipping dark liquor, his eyes following Sarah whenever she passed, though he said nothing. The storm had begun outside. Wind howled along the windows. Snow battered the roof like grains of salt on raw flesh, and somewhere beneath it all, the walls groaned, not from the weather, but from something older. After the last guest retired to a spare room and the house had begun to settle, Sarah moved with purpose. First, the dining room. She cleared the plates, took the silverware, but left the candles burning. Then the parlor. She folded the blankets, adjusted the curtains, opened the flue wide. At 2 midnight, she descended into the cellar. There, beside the coal bin, were 4 oil cans, each half full. She carried them one by one, careful not to spill a drop, spreading the contents over the floors, the stair rails, the wainscoting, even the tapestry in the east corridor where Amal's blood had dried in silence. She worked with the precision of a ritual, not hurried, not hesitant. The dolls were placed on the drawing-room mantel, each one facing outward. Beneath them, a line of salt. Sarah struck a match, then another. She lit the candles afresh, even those already burned low. She walked through the house, flame after flame, until the Bertram estate shimmered in gold and orange, the light reflecting off the glass like the eyes of 1,000 watching spirits. At last she returned to the main stairwell. Her footsteps were soft, her breath calm. At the top of the stairs she turned and looked once over the banister as if addressing the house itself. Then she let fall a single oil-soaked rag still burning into the puddle that pulled at the foot of the stairs. Fire speaks in tongues. It does not scream, it claims. The oil carried the flame swiftly, like blood seeking a heart. The walls ignited with a hungry glow. Smoke blossomed from curtains and portraits, rising in thick black clouds that smothered every name the house had ever spoken. Sarah did not flee. She walked through it untouched, her steps slow and sure, passing the twins' doors, the study, the master's chamber. Behind her, the ceilings cracked and fell. The house moaned its final confession, swallowed in flame and memory. By the time the townspeople saw the glow on the horizon, it was too late. The snow continued to fall, soundless, indifferent. Sarah was found at dawn, seated beside the well, her hands blackened, her face smudged with soot. She did not weep. She did not speak. She only watched the smoke rise, as if measuring how far. A soul must travel before it becomes untouchable. The courthouse in Danville was a building of stone and shadow, its white columns stained with age and rumor. In January of 1852, it held more than cold. It held the weight of a silence that had reached its breaking point. The town buzzed with speculation, fear, and morbid curiosity. Few dared speak Sarah's name aloud. Fewer still claimed to have truly known her. They said she confessed, without words, that, when the sheriff found her sitting by the well, ash in her hair and burn marks on her arms, she looked at him as though she had already stood trial elsewhere, somewhere deeper, older, more absolute. The remains of the Bertram house were sifted and catalogued. Charred bones, 3 wedding rings, the twisted remnants of a rifle, and fragments of china that had once served roast goose. Augustus's body was found in what had been the study, curled over a desk drawer, still clutched in blackened fingers. William and Jonathan were discovered together in the east wing hallway, one hand over the other, their mouths open in a final scream that no one heard. The trial was swift, if not just. Sarah was brought in chains, her back straight, her eyes steady. She wore a borrowed dress, too large at the shoulders, too thin for the cold. The courtroom was packed. White faces filled the benches, their expressions caught somewhere between revulsion and awe. A few former slaves, now free in name if not truth, stood at the back in silence. The judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing. Sarah looked at him, then beyond him as though trying to see something through the wall. Her voice was low, unshaken, "It was a clean Christmas," she said. The courtroom murmured. The judge struck the gavel once, twice, and gave her death. Hanging. No appeal. She was taken to the local jail to await execution, but she never saw the gallows. On the night of February 3rd, a fire broke out in the adjoining stable. Amid the chaos, the cell door was found unlocked, the guards confused, the keys missing. Some said she fled west, disguised as a boy. Others claimed she drowned herself in the river, though no body was ever recovered. And then there were whispers, old, persistent, carried by wind, and nosgariake time, that Sarah never left Danville at all. Children spoke of a woman seen at the edge of town during heavy snowfalls, wearing scorched clothes, her skin the color of earth, her eyes like mirrors. Farm hands refused to work near the ruins of the Bertram estate, saying the ground there refused to thaw no matter the season. Nothing grew, no animals lingered. The well, once the source of the house's water, remained, covered with planks, nailed shut with rusted iron spikes. In time, the story faded, as all stories do. But some names don't vanish. They smolder. There is a lesson buried in that frost-bitten soil, one no sermon ever taught. Not of forgiveness, not of repentance, but of silence breaking under the weight of memory of a woman made of ash and blood, who became something else entirely. Not a monster, not a martyr, just a reckoning with a face.